the thing is, I think the words language and dialect are really kind of charged with a lot of social meaning. For example, when people talk about indigenous languages in Mexico, be it Otomi or Nahuatl or Purépecha, for example, these when people call them, that's a dialect. People get quite upset. Say, no, it's not a dialect; it's a language.
Yeah, so there's this sort of status associated with language versus dialect. From a like this descriptivist linguistic point of view, the best you can say is really mutual comprehensibility. Right? If two people talk to each other and they can understand each other, then they're speaking the same language. Then you get the question of, well, what if they can mainly understand each other? But there are some some words or phrases that they don't get. That's where it gets sticky.
Exactly, because mutual intelligibility is not really a question of, it's not on off. I mean, for example, when I've had to speak to Brazilian people, and they will speak to me in Portuguese. I mean, I'm sure the way they're speaking Portuguese to me, they'll try to simplify it and kind of maybe even use words that they know are likely to be similar to Spanish. And I would probably do the same when speaking Spanish to them. So, I mean, I don't think there's really an argument to say that Portuguese and Spanish are the same language, but they're definitely mutually intelligible to some degree, even if that is just a small degree.
Yeah, I suppose, again, going back to these sort of dialects that are on or varieties that are on opposite sides of a border, right? There I guess that maybe works better or is even clearer in Europe, where the sort of where the population has been a lot more sort of settled, or I guess it's not been touched by a sort of large scale sort of change in the way that most of the rest of the world has been in the last 500 years, because all that colonial movement came out of Europe. So if you look at Europe, then you can you get this sort of really complicated picture of what we would call French blending into what we would call Spanish on one side, blending into what we would
rather than this is where the border is, this is where Spanish ends, this is where French starts.
Yeah, but to get that sort of picture, you need this sort of long historical sort of time frame.
So, but then a question is, you mentioned the social status. Let's use the word, or let's use the term linguistic variety. Let's not say it's a language. Let's say it's not a dialect. Blah blah. What would make, let's say, Otomi? Some people say is a dialect, and what would make Spanish a language? Is there anything inherently linguistic in the answer to that question?
No.
So is it just the case that Spanish is associated with power, money, wealth, seat of government, blah blah, and therefore, well, the way we speak is a language, and maybe Otomi is not so associated with power, money, wealth, etc., etc., and therefore, the way they speak, it's just a dialect.
I think largely yes, but I suppose there is some sort of linguistic aspect to this, in that I suppose the sort of in that sort of context, the language tends to have certain trappings which are linguistic that a dialect doesn't have. Like, it will, in many cases, right, the language will have a written standard. It will have some sort of standardizing body, like we talked about before,
Mm,
So it does, there are sort of linguistic things that it has that maybe a dialect doesn't have.
mm,
Um, but that doesn't make it um, any better in a
mm,
linguistic sense. It just means maybe that it's sort of more, it's easier to sort of define, whether you're speaking Spanish or not speaking Spanish, because it's so well, Spanish as a thing is so well studied and documented, whereas the sort of indigenous languages, are probably, not so well studied. So it's sort of, yeah, a bit less clear,
mm, mm,
which is which, or whether, if you wanted to, teach someone it as a second language, how you would go about that. If there are no textbooks, no dictionaries, no grammars,
mm,
like,
mm,
then it's slightly more difficult to say, what is and isn't, that language variety.
mm,
Um, so you can, yeah,
mm.
it gets a bit
Yeah,
difficult there.
yeah, it is a difficult question. But I think it would be important to emphasize the fact that in the same way that Spanish fulfills its primary objective, its primary function of I speak to you, you speak to me, we understand each other,
Oh,
all dialects do the same thing, right?
yes. Yeah. I mean, there's no linguistic variety which is not um,
Proficient.
fit for purpose
Mm-hmm.
as far as its speakers are concerned.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yep.
not to say that, there aren't things you can say in one language which you can't say in quite the same way in another language.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
that doesn't. I mean, that concept you're mentioning right now. I always give the same example for that. In Mexican Spanish, we have a word enchilarse, which
hmm
means you eat some spicy food, and all the kind of bodily reactions to that. And I always say to my students, well, how do you say enchilarse in English? And there's no one word which encapsulates that. I mean, you can say, oh, I can feel like my tongue's swelling, I'm sweating, and I'm drinking water, but it's not. But that's a really, really
yeah,
long, verbose way of saying enchilarse, right? But yes,
yeah,
that's not to say that therefore Spanish is better than English or more fit for purpose because it's got these kind of isolated cases.
no, it just tells you that you maybe tend to eat more spicy food.
Exactly, exactly. You're quite right. Good.